Picture this. 12 young men kneel in the dirt. Their hands are bound behind their backs. They are not soldiers. They are the terrified sons of Trojan nobility. Towering over them is Achilles. He doesn't make a speech. He doesn't hesitate. He grabs the first boy by the hair, pulls back his head, and slits his throat with a bronze sword. He drags the twitching body to a massive bonfire and throws it onto the flames. Then he turns back for the second boy. Then the third. He slaughters all 12 like cattle to vent his grief. This is not the golden hero from the movies. This is a war criminal committing a human sacrifice. This is the real story of Achilles. Before we dive into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you're discovering these hidden truths of history with us at Crimson Legacy Historians, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let us know where you're listening from. We at Crimson Legacy Historians find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Now, let's look at the blood on his hands. Homer included this massacre in the Iliad for a specific reason. He wanted to show us that Achilles had ceased to be human. To the ancient Greeks, mistreating a corpse or performing human sacrifice was a religious taboo, a pollution of the soul. But Achilles didn't care. By this point in the war, he operated beyond the laws of gods and men. The epic poem actually begins with a specific warning. The very first word is menace. It translates to rage, but that is too soft a word. Menace is a cosmic wrath, a force usually reserved only for Zeus or Apollo. When a human harnesses it, civilization cracks. The story of Achilles is simply the documentation of that crack spreading until it shatters everything. For 9 years, the Greek army rotted on the beaches of Troy. They were a loose collection of pirate kings raiding the coast for gold and women. Disease swept through the camp. Morale collapsed. In this chaos, Achilles served as the ultimate weapon. He didn't just fight. He exterminated. He led the Myrmidons, a shock troop unit that moved faster and struck harder than any other phalanx. But the man butchering boys at the funeral pyre was not born a monster. He was made one. We need to shatter the popular myth right now. You know the story. His mother dips him in the river Styx, holding him by the heel, making him invulnerable everywhere else. That is a Roman invention added centuries later to make the story palatable for children. The original Greek myths tell a much darker version of his origin. His mother, Thetis, did not use water. She used fire. Thetis despised the mortality she sensed in her infant son. She saw his human flesh as a defect, so every night she buried the baby Achilles in the red-hot embers of the palace hearth. She let the fire burn his skin, attempting to purge the human weakness out of him and replace it with divine endurance. She was forging a child like a blacksmith forges a sword. His father, Peleus, walked in on this ritual one night. He saw his wife roasting their screaming son in the fireplace and snatched the boy away. But the lesson remained. From infancy, Achilles learned that love looked like violence. He learned that to be special, you had to endure burning. This wasn't a childhood. It was an assembly line for a killer. To finish the job, his father sent him away to the wild. He didn't go to a prestigious academy. He went to Mount Pelion to live with Chiron the centaur. Forget the wise teacher figure you might expect. Chiron fed the boy a strict diet, the raw intestines of lions and the marrow of wild boars. Ancient logic followed the rules of sympathetic magic. You become what you consume. By eating the raw organs of apex predators, Achilles absorbed their aggression. He absorbed their lack of mercy. He grew up sleeping on hard ground, hunting bears on foot, and viewing empathy as a liability. By the time the Trojan War began, the Greeks didn't recruit a hero. They recruited a weapon of mass destruction. He had the body of a god and the emotional maturity of a stunted child driven by a desperate need for Cleo's eternal glory. He knew the prophecy. Go to Troy and die famous, or stay home and die forgotten. He chose the blood. But as we watch him toss those 12 Trojan boys onto the fire, we see the reality of that choice. He didn't just sacrifice his life for glory. He sacrificed his humanity, and the worst was yet to come. To understand the terror Achilles inspired, we must look at the tools of his trade. Forget the gleaming silver, plated steel you see in Hollywood blockbusters. The Trojan War was fought in the late Bronze Age. This was a world of soft metal. When two armies collided in 1200 BC, it sounded duller, heavier. As bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, it bends. It dents. It requires constant straightening after every skirmish. A sword strike didn't just cut, it bludgeoned. The armor of the period, like the famous Dendra panoply found by archaeologists, was not a fitted suit of medieval plate. It was a clumsy lobster-like casing of bronze sheets that restricted movement and cooked the man inside. But Achilles moved differently. The Iliad describes his gear with obsessive detail, distinguishing him from the clumsy conscripts around him. His lethality began with his spear. In the Greek text, it is called the Pylian ash. This wasn't a standard issue pike. It was a massive shaft of ashwood cut from the summit of Mount Pylian, the same wild peak where he ate lion intestines, and Homer makes a specific point to tell us the physics of this weapon. It was so heavy, so dense that no other Achaean hero could even lift it. Not Agamemnon, not the giant Ajax, not the clever Odysseus. Only Achilles could wield it. Think about the mechanics of that. In a duel, while other men are jabbing with light willowwood spears that might snap against a shield, Achilles is thrusting a heavy beam of timber tipped with bronze. When that mass hits a shield, it doesn't just pierce, it shatters the arm holding it. He wasn't fencing, he was battering his opponents into submission with superior kinetic energy. Then there were his soldiers. A general is only as good as his vanguard, and Achilles commanded the Myrmidons. Mythology claims these men were originally ants transformed into humans by Zeus to repopulate an island. It's a convenient fairy tale, but the truth is likely more unnerving. The ant-man metaphor perfectly describes their tactical behavior. In an era of disorganized tribal warfare, where battles were often chaotic brawls, the Myrmidons fought with a hive-mind discipline. They were shock troops from the rugged region of Thessaly. They didn't break rank, they swarmed. While other Greek kings like Menelaus commanded loose levies of farmers and fishermen who just wanted to go home, Achilles led a professional private army. They were the Bronze Age equivalent of Navy SEALs. They moved in silence. They followed their commander's rhythm. When Achilles charged, the Myrmidons surged like a black tide behind him, creating a force multiplier that could break any Trojan line. We also have to talk about what they looked like. It wasn't just bronze. The archaeological record gives us a detail that is far more terrifying than shining metal. Many warriors of this specific era, including Odysseus and the Myrmidons, wore helmets made of boar tusks. To make a single helmet, a hunter had to kill 40 or 50 wild boars. Think about the visual signal that sends. When you stared across the battlefield at a phalanx of Myrmidons, you weren't looking at shiny crests. You were looking at thousands of dead animal teeth. Rows upon rows of ivory trophies harvested from dangerous beasts, stitched onto leather caps. It signaled that these men were apex predators. Achilles led this pack of wolves. He didn't fight for patriotism. He didn't fight for Helen. He fought because it was the only economy he understood. Before the siege of Troy settled into the 10-year stalemate we know, Achilles decimated the surrounding region. He sacked 12 coastal cities and 11 inland towns. He turned the war into a business. He raided livestock, burned villages, and sold the women he captured. This was the reality of the hero's life. It was piracy on a grand scale. This relentless raiding built his legend, but it also sowed the seeds of his destruction. He wasn't just accumulating gold. He was accumulating time. In ancient Greek culture, time meant honor, but it was physical. It was tangible. You measured a man's honor by the pile of loot in his tent and the number of girls in his bed. If you took away the loot, you didn't just steal his property, you erased his honor. You socially castrated him. This is the critical context for what happens next. Achilles is a man who has been psychologically conditioned to kill, armed with a spear no one else can lift, leading a death squad of ant-men and operating on a currency of violent plunder. He is a powder keg waiting for a spark. And that spark wouldn't come from a Trojan sword. It would come from his own commander. In chief over the one thing Achilles valued more than blood, his prize. Before the Myrmidons, before the pile of loot, and before the title of best of the Achaeans, the world's greatest killer tried to be a ghost. There is a bizarre chapter in Trojan War history that often gets glossed over because it doesn't fit the hyper-masculine image of the hero. Just months before the fleet launched, Achilles wasn't sharpening his spear. He was wearing a dress hiding in a harem on the island of Scyros. His mother, Thetis, terrified by the prophecy that her son would die at Troy, smuggled him into the court of King Lycomedes. She disguised him as a girl, gave him the name Pirha, and hid him among the king's daughters. Imagine the psychological tension of this scene. You have a young man raised on lion intestines and marrow. A boy who has been physically conditioned to shatter bones, now forced to sit still in silk robes, weaving wool and making polite conversation. He was a wolf trying to pass as a sheep. It was an impossible acting job. The Greek kings knew they couldn't take Troy without him. So they sent their master manipulator, Odysseus, to hunt him down. Odysseus knew he couldn't just knock on the door and ask for Achilles. He needed a trap. He needed to trigger the boy's instinct. Odysseus arrived at the palace posed as a merchant, and he laid out his wares in the great hall for the king's daughters to inspect. On one side of the table, he spread out expensive jewelry, perfumes, and fine textiles, the expected desires of royal women. On the other side, hidden slightly beneath the fabrics, he placed a few items of high-quality weaponry, a sturdy shield, and a razor-sharp spear. The princesses flocked to the jewelry. They held up the necklaces, laughing and admiring the gold, but one girl stood apart. The disguised Achilles drifted toward the steel. His hands didn't reach for the perfume. They hovered over the grip of the sword. His body language betrayed him. The muscle memory of the warrior was screaming to be released. Then Odysseus signaled his men outside. They blew a war trumpet, a sudden deafening blast that signaled an immediate attack. Panic erupted in the hall. The real princesses screamed and fled for cover, but Pyrrha didn't run away. He stripped off his disguise in a heartbeat, seized the shield and spear from the table, and scanned the room for enemies ready to kill. The mask fell. The predator revealed himself. Odysseus grabbed his arm and smiled. The draft dodging was over. This moment is crucial because it crystallizes the tragedy of Achilles. He had a way out. He was safe on Scyros. He could have chosen the long life half of the prophecy. He could have married, raised children, and died an old anonymous man in a warm bed. But the moment the trumpet sounded, his nature made the choice for him. He was biologically incapable of cowardice. He boarded the ship with Odysseus, knowing exactly what it meant. He wasn't sailing to a victory parade. He was sailing to his own funeral. Once they landed at Troy, the clock started ticking. For 9 years, he suppressed the knowledge of his impending death by burying himself in the violence we discussed earlier. He became the sacker of cities, the engine of the Greek war effort. But the tension between his mortal fate and his divine rage was building. He was doing all the work, taking all the risks and winning the war for Agamemnon, the High King of Mycenae. Agamemnon was a bureaucrat, a man who commanded from the back, yet claimed the lion's share of the glory. This dynamic, the resentment between the talent in the field and the management in the tent, is timeless. It happens in modern corporations, and it happened in the Bronze Age. And it brings us to the inciting incident of the Iliad. The spark wasn't strategy or territory. It was a woman named Briseis. But do not mistake this for a romance novel. In the context of the ancient world, Briseis was not a girlfriend. She was a trophy. She was a living medal of honor awarded to Achilles by the army. She was the physical proof of his theme. When Agamemnon, in a fit of petty insecurity, decided to seize Briseis for himself, he didn't just break a heart. He broke the social contract of the entire army. He told Achilles, "Your value is 0. Your achievements are mine." For a man who had chosen death over life just to be remembered, this was the ultimate insult. The beast that Odysseus had unleashed on Scyros was about to turn its teeth away from the Trojans and snap at its own masters. When Achilles stopped fighting, the war didn't just stall, it reversed. The Iliad devotes massive sections to the days immediately following his withdrawal, painting a picture of absolute catastrophe for the Greeks. Without the Myrmidons anchoring the line, the Achaean formation lost its spine. The Trojans, who had spent years cowering behind their massive walls, whenever Achilles was on the field, suddenly realized the predator was gone. They opened the Scaean gates and poured out like a dam breaking. Leading them was Hector. We need to talk about Hector. In pop culture, he is often the good guy, the family man defending his home. And while that is true, Homer's text explains a different side of him during these days. Without Achilles to check him, Hector became a juggernaut. He wasn't just defending, he was hunting. He drove the Greeks back across the plain, mile by bloody mile, forcing them into a humiliating retreat toward their beached ships. The situation grew so desperate that the Greeks had to do something unprecedented in the war. They stopped attacking and started building. They hastily constructed a massive defensive wall and a trench around their own ships. Think about the humiliation of that. The invaders who came to lay siege to a city were now besieged themselves on the edge of the ocean, inside the camp of the Myrmidons. The atmosphere was suffocating. Imagine being a member of the world's most elite special forces unit, listening to your allies being slaughtered a few hundred yards away and being ordered to polish your shield. Achilles sat in his tent playing a lyre, singing songs of old glory while the smell of burning Greek corpses wafted in on the sea breeze. This was the height of his strike. It was a cold, calculated political maneuver. He was letting his fellow soldiers die. Men he had eaten with, men he had sailed with, just to prove to Agamemnon that he was indispensable. It was passive aggression on a genocidal scale. The turning point came when the Trojan advance became unstoppable. Hector smashed through the Greek fortifications with a massive stone, shattering the gates. The Trojans flooded the camp. Torch in hand, Hector lunged for the ships. This was the nightmare scenario. If the ships burned, the Greeks had no way home. They would be trapped in hostile territory destined for slavery or execution. The smoke billowed black into the sky, visible even from the Myrmidon camp. Patroclus, Achilles' closest companion, could take it no longer. He watched the destruction of the army and wept. He begged Achilles, "If you won't fight, at least let me. Let me wear your armor. Let me lead the Myrmidons. If the Trojans see your helmet, they will think you have returned, and they will run." Achilles looked at the fire consuming the ships. His pride still wouldn't let him fight, but his possessiveness over his legacy allowed a compromise. He agreed to let Patroclus play the part. He gave Patroclus his armor, that terrifying bronze casing that everyone knew. He gave him the Myrmidons, but he gave him one strict order, a command that would seal both their fates. Drive them from the ships, but do not pursue them to the walls of Troy. Do not rob me of my glory. It was a warning given in selfishness, but disguised as concern. Patroclus donned the armor. He strapped on the greaves, the breastplate, and the helmet with the horsehair crest. But there was one thing he could not take: the Pylian ash. The massive spear of Achilles remained in the rack. Patroclus wasn't strong enough to lift it. He took a lesser spear, rallied the ant men, and charged out of the camp. The effect was electric. The Trojans, seeing the silhouette of their nightmare, panicked. They thought the Reaper had returned. They broke rank and fled. Patroclus, intoxicated by the sudden power, by the adrenaline of leading the most lethal unit in the world, forgot the warning. He didn't stop at the ships. He chased the fleeing Trojans across the plain, slaughtering them by the dozen, driving them right back to the shadow of the great walls. He was winning. He was a god of war until he wasn't. In the dust and chaos beneath the walls, Patroclus pushed too far. He encountered a force he couldn't handle. Apollo, the god who favored Troy, struck him from behind, knocking the helmet from his head. The deception was over. Everyone saw it wasn't Achilles. Then came Euphorbus, a young Trojan who stabbed him in the back, and finally Hector. Hector finished the job with a spear to the belly. As Patroclus lay dying in the dirt, gasping out his last words, he warned Hector that his victory was hollow, and that death was already standing behind him. But the most dangerous moment wasn't the death itself. It was the message. A runner took off from the battlefield, sprinting toward the tent where Achilles waited, carrying the news that would shatter the world. The strike was over. The slaughter was about to begin. When Antilochus delivered the news, "Patroclus is dead," Achilles did not rage immediately. He collapsed. The Iliad describes a scene of primal devastation. The strongest man alive fell to the ground, clawing at the earth with his hands. He poured black dust over his golden hair and defiled his face with filth. He lay there like a fallen statue, occupying so much space that the text describes him as mighty in his mightiness, sprawling in the dust. This wasn't just sadness. It was a total psychological amputation. Patroclus and Achilles were not just comrades. They were two halves of one soul. With Patroclus gone, the human half of Achilles died. But grief in the Bronze Age was dangerous. While Achilles wept, the Trojans were still fighting over Patroclus's body. They wanted to drag it back to Troy, cut off the head, and mount it on a spike. Hector had already stripped the corpse. He was now wearing Achilles' own armor, the divine bronze gifted by the gods to his father. Think about the horror of that. To fight Hector now, Achilles would have to strike at his own silhouette. He would have to stab through his own breastplate. But he had a problem. He was unarmed. He had no armor, no spear, no shield. He was naked to the enemy. But his rage was so potent that he didn't need steel. He rose from the dust and walked to the edge of the Greek trench. He didn't cross it. He just stood there, silhouetted against the setting sun. Homer tells us that the goddess Athena draped a golden cloud around his head and ignited it so that flames seemed to pour from his scalp. And then he screamed. He didn't shout a command. He didn't call for a rally. He released a roar, an inarticulate war cry. It was a sound so terrifying, so unnatural that chaos erupted in the Trojan ranks. Charioteers lost control of their horses. Soldiers turned and trampled each other. In the sheer panic caused by the sound of his voice alone, 12 Trojan soldiers died, impaled on their own spears or crushed by their own chariots. He hadn't lifted a finger. He had simply announced his return. The Trojans, terrified, abandoned Patroclus's body and fled behind their walls. The sun went down, ending the fighting, but the night that followed was sleepless for everyone. Back in the tent, Achilles refused to wash the blood and dust from his skin. He refused to eat. He refused to sleep. He swore he would not bury Patroclus until he had brought back the head of Hector and the severed heads of 12 Trojan nobles. The beast was fully awake now, but he still needed armor. Thetis, weeping for her son, went to the only being capable of forging gear fit for a demigod, Hephaestus, the smith of the gods. What Hephaestus created that night was not just a tool for defense. It was a masterpiece of tragic irony. The shield of Achilles is famous in literature, but its meaning is often missed. On its surface, the god hammered out a panorama of the entire world. He depicted the earth, the sky, and the sea. He created 2 cities of men, one at peace filled with weddings, dancing, and law courts, and one at war filled with ambushes and strife. He depicted fields of plowed earth, vineyards heavy with grapes, and young people singing. He put the entire beautiful world that Achilles was about to leave onto the shield. When Achilles received the armor the next morning, the other Myrmidons were afraid to look at it. The sheen of the metal was too bright, too painful. Only Achilles could look at it without blinking. His eyes, the poet says, flared like blowtorches. He strapped on the greaves. He fitted the breastplate. He picked up the shield that held the images of the life he was rejecting. Marriage, harvest, peace. He was carrying the world he could never have on his arm. Then he went to the stables. He yoked his immortal horses, Xanthus and Balius. In a moment of supernatural dread, Hera gave the horse Xanthus the power of speech. The animal turned its head and warned him, "We will save you today, mighty Achilles, but your day of death is near." Achilles didn't blink. He answered the horse with cold fury. "Why do you prophesy my death? I know it well. I know I am destined to die here, far from my father and mother, but I will not stop until I've given the Trojans their fill of blood." He mounted the chariot. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He was a force of nature, a dead man walking, seeking company for the grave. The slaughter that was about to unfold would make the previous 9 years of war look like a skirmish. The river was waiting. Achilles cut the Trojan army in half. He drove one panic-stricken group toward the city walls, but he herded the other half, thousands of men, into the deep, swirling waters of the river Scamander. What followed was not a battle. It was an industrial liquidation. Achilles leaped into the water with only his sword. The Iliad describes the scene with gruesome clarity. The water turned crimson almost instantly. The sounds of screaming men and the splashing of water echoed off the canyon walls. He moved through the river like a thresher shark in a bait ball, hacking at anything that moved. There was no strategy here, only the mechanical repetition of slaughter. In the middle of this carnage, a young Trojan prince named Lycaon crawled out of the mud and grabbed Achilles' knees. He begged for his life. He offered a ransom. In any other phase of the war, a Greek hero would have accepted the gold. But Achilles was no longer operating on the logic of commerce. He looked down at the terrified boy and delivered one of the most chilling speeches in literature. "Come, friend, you too must die. Why moan about it so? Even Patroclus died, a far, far better man than you. And look, you see how handsome and powerful I am. Even I have death waiting for me. There will be a dawn or a sunset or a noon when someone will take my life in battle. So die." He didn't kill Lycaon out of anger. He killed him out of nihilistic camaraderie. He slashed the boy's neck and threw him into the current for the fish to eat. But the slaughter was too efficient. The sheer volume of corpses clogged the channels. The river stopped flowing. This brings us to the most surreal moment of the Greek mythology documentary canon. The river itself woke up. In the ancient mind, landscape was alive. The river god's commander, choked by the blood and the bodies blocking his flow, rose up in human form to confront the killer. He roared at Achilles to stop filling his beautiful channels with dead meat. Achilles, arrogant and blood-drunk, told the god to get out of his way. The river attacked. A massive wave, dark with gore and debris, rose up and crashed down on the hero. This wasn't a metaphor. Homer describes a physical wrestling match between a man and a force of nature. The currents battered Achilles, dragging him under, stripping the ground from beneath his feet. The water beat against his shield, trying to drown the fire that burned inside him. For the first time, Achilles was afraid. He didn't fear Hector. He didn't fear swords. He feared an ignoble death, drowning like a swineherd in a muddy ditch, erased by water without glory. He screamed to the heavens, blaming his mother for lying to him, begging not to die wet and obscure. The gods intervened. Hera sent Hephaestus to save him. The smith god turned his flamethrowers on the river. It was elemental warfare, fire against water. The plains of Troy caught fire. The elms and willows lining the banks incinerated. The water boiled. The river god, scalded and steaming, finally surrendered. Achilles climbed out of the boiling mud. He was steamed, scorched, and covered in blood. But he was alive, and now there was nothing standing between him and the walls of Troy. The river had failed to stop him. The army had failed to stop him. Only one man remained outside the gates. Hector. Hector stood alone. His parents, Priam and Hecuba, screamed from the ramparts, tearing their hair, begging him to come inside. They saw what was coming across the plain. It wasn't a man anymore. It was a calamity wrapped in divine armor, shining like the star Sirius, the star of disaster. But Hector didn't move. His pride pinned him to the spot. He had led the Trojans to disaster the day before. He couldn't face the shame of retreating now. He chose to stand his ground. Achilles closed the distance. The wind howled. The stage was set for the final duel of the Bronze Age. This is the moment Hollywood always gets wrong. In the movies, Achilles versus Hector is a stoic, honorable duel of swordsmen. In the Iliad, it is a hunt. When Achilles charged, the greatest defender of Troy did not brace his shield. He broke. Panic seized Hector's limbs. The sheer radiating aura of violence coming from Achilles was too much for the human mind to withstand. Hector turned and ran. This isn't a critique of his bravery. It is a testament to Achilles' monstrosity. They ran around the walls of Troy 3 times. Imagine the humiliation. The king of Troy, the queen, and all the citizens watched from the ramparts as their savior sprinted for his life, like a frightened deer, pursued by a nightmare in divine armor. Achilles chased him in silence, forbidding his men to fire arrows. He signaled with his head, "He is mine. No one touches him but me." Hector only stopped because he was tricked. The goddess Athena, wanting to end the war, disguised herself as Hector's brother. She appeared beside him, breathless, promising to stand and fight by his side. Emboldened by this false hope, Hector finally turned to face his pursuer. He tried to negotiate. He offered a pact. "If I kill you, I will strip your armor, but return your body to the Greeks. Promise me you will do the same." Achilles looked at him with dead eyes. His response is the definition of hatred. "Do not talk to me of pacts, you mad man. There are no treaties between men and lions. There are no pacts between wolves and lambs. One of us will glut the god of war with his blood." The fight was short. Hector threw his spear. It bounced off Hephaestus's shield. He turned to his brother for a spare, but the brother was gone. The illusion vanished. Hector realized in a cold wash of horror that the gods had abandoned him. He drew his sword for a final desperate charge. Achilles knew the armor Hector was wearing. It was his own old armor stripped from Patroclus. He knew its weak points perfectly. As Hector charged, Achilles drove his massive ash spear into the small gap at the collarbone, right through the tender flesh of the neck. Hector fell. He didn't die instantly. He lay in the dust, gasping, begging once more for his body to be returned to his parents. Achilles stood over him and whispered, "I only wish I had the stomach to hack your meat off and eat it raw for what you've done." Hector died, predicting Achilles' own death at the hands of Paris and Apollo. Achilles pulled his spear out and said, "I will accept my own death whenever Zeus wills it." Then began the desecration. Killing Hector wasn't enough. The rage demanded more. Achilles stripped the body. Then, in front of Hector's screaming parents on the wall, he took a knife and slit the tendons behind Hector's ankles. Between the heel and the bone, He threaded leather straps through the holes and tied the corpse to the back of his chariot. He whipped the horses. The chariot lurched forward. The head of the Prince of Troy, once accustomed to soft pillows, slammed into the hard earth. Achilles dragged him all the way back to the Greek ships. And he didn't stop there. For 12 days, every morning, Achilles woke up, tied the body to his chariot, and dragged it 3 times around the tomb of Patroclus. He wanted to erase Hector physically. He wanted to grind the man into paste. Apollo, pitying the dead prince, used his power to wrap the body in a golden shield of protection, preventing the skin from ripping and the dogs from eating it. But the intent remained. This was the nadir of Achilles' soul. He had conquered Troy's greatest warrior, but in doing so, he had become something less than human. He was a creature of pure hate, trapped in a cycle of grief that no amount of blood could wash away. The Greeks watched in uncomfortable silence. This wasn't war anymore. It was madness. For 12 days, Achilles existed in a fugue state of violence. But the gods had seen enough. Zeus sent a message: the body must be returned. Across the lines, King Priam of Troy prepared for a suicide mission. He loaded a wagon with gold, fine fabrics and cauldrons, a ransom fit for a prince. Then, under the cover of darkness, and guided by the god Hermes, the old man drove straight into the Greek camp. He bypassed the sentries. He bypassed the trench where the massacre had taken place. He walked right up to the door of the lodge, where the man who murdered his son sat eating his dinner. Priam entered alone. The Myrmidons froze. They stared at this old man, appearing like a ghost in the torchlight. Before Achilles could reach for a weapon, Priam did the unthinkable. He dropped to his knees. He reached out and grabbed the hands of Achilles, the very hands that had slaughtered so many of his children, and he kissed them. This gesture broke the universe of the Iliad. In a war defined by pride and retaliation, absolute humility was the only weapon left. Priam didn't ask for mercy. He asked for empathy. He looked up at the killer and said, "Think of your father, O Achilles. He is old like me. He waits for you at home, hoping to see you return. But I am unparalleled in misery. I have 50 sons, and you have killed the best of them. I have done what no other man on earth has done. I have pressed my lips to the hand of the man who killed my son." The mention of his father, Peleus, struck Achilles harder than any spear. He realized suddenly that he would never see his father again. He realized that Peleus would soon be just like Priam, a grieving old man waiting for a son who would never come home. The rage, the menace finally cracked. Achilles took the old king's hand and gently pushed him away, not in anger, but in shared sorrow. The two enemies sat in the tent and wept together. Priam wept for Hector. Achilles wept for his father and for Patroclus. The sound of their grief filled the room. For a brief moment, the war stopped. There were no Greeks or Trojans, only 2 broken men confronting the cruelty of mortality. Achilles stood up. He ordered his serving women to wash and anoint Hector's body. He wanted to make sure Priam didn't see the carnage inflicted on the corpse, fearing the old man's anger might flare up and force Achilles to kill him. Violating the laws of hospitality, he lifted Hector's body onto the wagon himself. Then he did something even more surprising. He invited Priam to eat. They shared a meal, bread and meat, acknowledging that life must continue even in the face of death. Achilles promised a truce. He asked Priam how many days he needed to bury Hector. Priam asked for 11 days of mourning with the burial on the 10th and a feast on the 11th. On the 12th day, they would fight again. Achilles agreed. "I will hold back the Argive army for as long as you require." He grasped Priam's right wrist to reassure him, a solemn oath. The old king slept in the enemy camp that night, safe under the protection of his son's murderer. When Priam rode back to Troy at dawn with Hector's body, the cycle of rage had been suspended. Achilles had reclaimed his humanity. He was no longer a beast or a god. He was a man again capable of pity. But as he watched the wagon disappear, he knew the clock was ticking. The truce would end. The war would resume and his own time was running out. The truce held for 11 days. The smoke from Hector's funeral pyre faded into the Aegean sky. Then on the 12th morning, the drums beat and the meat grinder turned back on. Achilles returned to the field, but he was different now. The rage had cooled into a cold, grim determination. He knew he was living on borrowed time. The prophecy was specific. He would die shortly after Hector. Every step he took toward the walls of Troy was a step toward his own grave. He didn't just fight local conscripts anymore. In the final phase of his life, he fought legends. He struck down Penthesilea, the queen of the Amazons. He slaughtered Memnon, the warrior king of Ethiopia who had come to save Troy. He was clearing the board, removing every obstacle between the Greeks and the city. Finally, he did what no Greek had ever done. He breached the Scaean gates. He was inside the city. This was the moment of absolute victory. If he kept going, he would sack Troy single-handedly. But the gods have boundaries, and Achilles had crossed them all. Apollo, the protector of the city, stood atop the walls. He had warned Achilles once before. He would not warn him again. Crouched in the shadows of the gate tower was Paris. History loves irony. Paris was the antithesis of Achilles. He was a lover, not a fighter. He preferred perfume to blood. He fought with a bow, a weapon that, in the code of the Bronze Age elite, was often viewed with disdain. It was the weapon of the coward who dared not look his enemy in the eye. But a bow can kill a god if the aim is true. Paris drew the string. He didn't aim with skill. He aimed with desperation. But he didn't need skill. Apollo, invisible to the mortals below, reached down and guided the flight of the arrow. It didn't strike Achilles in the heart or the head. It struck him in the heel. Now, whether you believe the myth of the river Styx, that his heel was his only dry, vulnerable spot, or the medical reality, the result is the same. A severed Achilles tendon cripples a man instantly. You cannot stand. You cannot charge. The greatest runner in the Greek army, the man they called swift-footed Achilles, was suddenly anchored to the earth. He fell. The pain would have been blinding. But the psychological shock was worse. He wasn't dying in a glorious duel with a worthy equal. He was being picked off from a distance by the man who had started this whole mess, a man he considered beneath contempt. Paris fired again and again. Achilles crashed into the dust of the city he almost conquered. The sheer anti-climax of it stunned the battlefield. The invincible warlord was just meat after all. The fight for his corpse was more vicious than the fight for the city. Odysseus and the giant Ajax fought back to back, holding off the entire Trojan army to retrieve the body. They refused to let the Trojans do to Achilles what Achilles had done to Hector. Ajax carried the massive body of his cousin back to the ships while Odysseus held off the attackers. They brought him back to the camp, but the silence was deafening. The weapon was broken. The funeral of Achilles dwarfed even Patroclus's. The muses themselves came down to sing the dirge. His mother, Thetis, rose from the sea with her sisters, their wailing echoing across the water. They built a pyre that lit up the dunes. They mixed his ashes with those of Patroclus in a golden urn. Finally, in death, the two were reunited. Their bones mingling in the same vessel, buried under a great mound on the headland that could be seen by sailors for centuries to come. He had achieved his goal. He had traded a long life for eternal glory. He had his Cleos. But as the flames died down and the Greeks looked at the pile of ash that used to be a demigod, a haunting question remained. Was it worth it? The answer wouldn't come from the living. It would come from the dead. Because the story of Achilles doesn't end in the dirt of Troy. It ends in the darkness of the underworld, with a final confession that changes everything we think we know about heroism. The story of the Trojan War usually ends with the fall of the city. But the story of Achilles has an epilogue hidden in a completely different book. Years after the war, Odysseus, the man who dragged Achilles out of hiding on Scyros, travels to the underworld in Homer's Odyssey. He performs a dark ritual to speak with the dead. Among the drifting shadows, he spots the ghost of Achilles. Odysseus, ever the diplomat, tries to comfort his old friend. He tells Achilles, "Do not grieve at your death. When you were alive, we honored you like a god. And now that you're here, you're a mighty prince among the dead. You have your glory. You have your Cleos." Achilles' reply shatters the entire warrior code of the Bronze Age. He looks at Odysseus with infinite regret and delivers the most important line in Greek mythology. "Do not speak soothingly to me of death, glorious Odysseus. I would rather be a paid laborer to a poor man on earth, a slave to a peasant with no land, than be the king of all these breathless dead." Think about the weight of that admission. For his entire short life, Achilles sacrificed everything for fame. He gave up marriage. He gave up fatherhood. He gave up peace. And he gave up old age. All for the promise that his name would be remembered forever. He treated life as a currency to buy immortality. But now, standing on the other side, he realizes the scam. Being a legend is cold comfort when you don't have a body to feel the sun. He would trade all the statues, all the poems, And all the glory just to be a nobody sweating in a field, breathing fresh air for one more day. This is the brutal truth about Achilles. He isn't a hero to be emulated. He is a warning. We live in a world that is obsessed with legacy. We're told to grind, to hustle, to sacrifice our health and our relationships to make a dent in the universe. We look at billionaires and celebrities the way the Greeks looked at Achilles, as people who have transcended the ordinary. But the ghost in the underworld tells us we are wrong. The rage that drove him didn't liberate him. It consumed him. The glory he bought with blood was a hollow trophy. In the end, the simple act of living, of eating bread with a friend, of feeling the rain, of holding a hand, is worth more than all the honor in the world.